So let's get right into it. So the ticket in the door for this week is just to brainstorm, what role do you think the literacy coach plays in data collection and or data analysis specifically? So think about that. You might want to jot down some notes, especially as you're thinking about what you read. That would be a good time to do that. So our agenda for this week, obviously we're just looking at data. So we're going to talk about data-driven instruction, and I'm going to share with you a protocol that we have used across the state to teach teachers how to analyze data in a very non-judgmental way, which you'll see what I mean when we get into it. And then we're going to practice analyzing assessment data. We're going to look at student level data, and we're going to look at school level data, but it kind of can also serve as classroom level data. And again, you'll see what I mean when we go there too. So it does look like a lot of learning targets, but they're all kind of interrelated. So the first, I can describe the DDI process, that's data-driven instruction, and I can engage in the DDD process, which is data-driven dialogue, that's the protocol, to analyze assessment data. I can analyze school level assessment data to determine the strengths and needs of the grade level, and then I can analyze student level data to determine a student's specific strengths and needs. And then finally, I can describe the role the literacy coach plays in data collection and analysis. So again, sounds like a lot, but everything we're doing today is purely focused on data. So when we talk about data-driven instruction, this should have been right from your reading. It's right from, well, it should be similar to your reading. So data-driven instruction, really all it has to do with this systemic approach. This is really the key here, is that it's a process to look at data, and the whole point of it isn't just for the sake of looking at data, but it's to constantly keep in mind how to improve student learning. And it sounds really obvious, but sometimes when we get into the weeds, when we look at data, it's easy to forget about the students. And it sounds crazy, but it is. So it's this formula, if you will, or more of a process. It's a cycle, and it's all kind of inquiry based. So it's the cycle of when you assess, you analyze that data, and then you take action, like create an action plan from it. What am I going to teach next? What is something that needs an intervention? You do whatever that action is, you assess it again, you analyze that data from your assessment, you take another action. Makes sense, right? So it's iterative, it's cyclical. It is this constant cycle that has to do with thinking about what students are doing, analyzing it deeply, not just looking at a grade, but analyzing it deeply, and then taking action, very specific action. So when we think about data-driven instruction, there really are four key principles. Obviously, the first is assessment, right? You have to assess, but the point is, first, those assessments have to be rigorous, not hard, but rigorous. So they have to be aligned to standards. If everything we're teaching is aligned to standards, our assessments absolutely have to be aligned to the standards as well. And then they also have to be interim, meaning they happen at certain increments over the course of a year. And that doesn't mean like big benchmarks are often beginning, middle, end. It has to be much more often than that, because if we're only looking at assessment data beginning of the year, then mid-year, think about how much instructional time falls in that time. There could be lots of missed opportunities. So it has to be much more regular to give you meaningful data to inform your instruction. So with assessment, obviously, we have to analyze. If you're going to bother assessing, you have to do something with the data, right? Make it meaningful. So you have to very closely examine the results. And you're not just looking at strengths and needs, which you are, but you're looking at causes of the strengths and needs. If you're only looking at what the strengths and needs are and addressing them, it's kind of just putting a Band-Aid on a problem. You have to look more closely and more deeply to find the causes so you can really rectify any issues that need to be rectified. The third is then take action. You've done the assessment, you've analyzed all the data, you got to do something with it, right? So that means teaching based on your findings, right? And giving your students exactly what it is that they need to learn and grow. And then the fourth is much bigger picture. It's culture. It's establishing a culture, a data-driven culture. And that's not something that's necessarily left up to the individual teacher or a literacy coach, but it's important that whole schools or even whole districts really embrace this idea of using data to inform instruction. I don't know where you are, or if you've ever seen, some schools have like data walls, and they have like regular team meetings or PLCs or grade level meetings where they actually use those data walls to like analyze where students are and then make plans. It's a part of a culture. That's really important. If only a few teachers are buying into it, then it's not really going to drive student learning as powerfully as it could, if that makes sense. So ultimately, when you're working through this process of data-driven instruction, the focus is always on, are our students learning? That is purely what the focus is. Are our students learning? So a traditional emphasis would usually be, are you teaching what you're supposed to be teaching, right? I'm sure you've heard of teachers talking about like they have so much to cover. And if they would look at like especially like state test data or even bigger benchmarks, they'd be looking at it to say, okay, did I teach all of the things that I was supposed to teach? That's all right, but that's really not all that helpful. The shift has to be made to looking at, are students learning? Are they learning what it is that we're teaching? It's such a subtle shift, but it is so important to make that shift. That when we're looking at data, we are not thinking of the teacher. We have to be focused on the students, okay? So think about that for a minute. How does this compare to the instruction assessment cycle that you engage in on a daily basis? So we know the instruction assessment cycle, you can't teach without assessing, and you can't assess without teaching, right? It's kind of the same thing. You plan based on what you know, data. You teach, you assess, you look at that assessment data. Did students meet the learning target? Sweet, move on. Did they not? Okay, I need to reteach. Now let me plan that. And it's the same kind of cycle. So it really isn't any different than that. It's just purely looking at, our students learning in general, whereas the instruction assessment cycle is focused more on like a very targeted learning target or a piece of a standard, if that makes sense. All right, let's move into data-driven dialogue. So in order to really use data to inform our instruction, we have to actually dialogue with the data. Now that sounds crazy, right? Like you look at a page of data, numbers, like how do you have a dialogue with it? Well, I have a protocol that's going to help you to do that. The point of this DDD protocol is to help you suspend judgment. Now, think about it. If you say, give your students a spelling test and little Johnny only got 3 out of 10 correct, you might say things like, well, he came in a terrible mood. He had a fight on the bus. I could tell he was hungry. He didn't have breakfast today. All of those things are completely valid, right? But they're judgments. That's not actually what the data is telling you. And that's not necessarily the cause of why he only got 3 out of 10 correct. He might not have known those prefixes and suffixes. He might not have known the letter patterns, right? So it's so important to look at the data just to see what the data is saying without any of those judgments. And that's hard to do. And that's why this protocol is so helpful, because it forces you to not include any hunches or feelings when you're looking at the data, and you're not really looking at symptoms per se, but you're simply looking at what the data is saying. And only then can you make some inferences or ask some questions. So let me show you what I mean. So this process happens in 4 phases. The first one, before you even look at data, you make predictions. And this it helps you get all those things, those judgments or assumptions out of your head and on paper, so they're out for when you're looking at the data. You write those down. Then you look at the data and you go through a process to make it visually easier to understand. We call it Go Visual, and I'm going to show you a process called Stoplight Highlight to make that happen. Once you do that, then you just observe, literally, what is the data showing you? And once you do that, can you make your inferences and ask questions? Make sense? So here's kind of more of a breakdown. In the predict phase, you just think about things like, what do you know about the grade level? What do you know about those students? What do you know about the curriculum or the standards that you're assessing? What needs might they have? What barriers might they have? You think about all those things up front, kind of get them out of the way. Then you go visual. We'll use Stoplight Highlight. to make that data visually more understandable. So once you do that, you're just observing, just noting what you see, not why you see it, just what you see. And it does take practice to kind of self-talk and say, no, am I really just saying what I'm seeing, or am I giving them the why? And then once you go through that observation, you can infer or ask some questions. Why do you see the findings? What questions might you want to ask to dig a little bit deeper into your findings? This is a nice visual with some prompts, so when you're working with a team and you're in a phase, it can kind of support the work or push you through. So I like to hand this out to literacy coaches who do guide this work with teachers. So maybe keep this somewhere as a nice handout, or really just a planning tool for you in the future. But okay, so we're going to try analyzing school level data. We're going to start with school level data. And what we're going to look at is the 3rd grade ELA state assessment data. I'm not telling you what the district is, but let's just think about 3rd grade ELA state assessment data. So you're going to start by making predictions, right? So some predictions might be that scores are not high because 3rd grade is the first year they take a state test. Students might not have the stamina, which could impact grades or scores. Students might struggle with writing prompts. Students might struggle with any questions on standards that have to do with more like synthesis or integration of ideas. These are just some predictions that you might make, okay? So what you would do is, let me pull up, there is a note catcher that we use to guide this process, the data-driven dialogue note catcher. So before you look at the data, right in here, you record those predictions, get them out of your head, okay? So ideally, you can have this open. You might have even printed it out, and you would record your predictions for 3rd grade ELA assessment data. Make sense? Okay, so then we are going to actually look at the data, but we have to make it, we have to go visual. So this idea of stoplight highlight, think about a stoplight, red, yellow, green, right? If you think about looking at student work, something you would want to highlight as green is obviously like they got it, good to go. I don't really need to worry too much about it. Yellow is like they kind of have it, might need a little bit of work, or they're just under the standard. That's yellow. Red, or you'd have a pink highlighter, is whoa, they do not have the skill, they don't have the concept. I am alarmed. That's really what the pink is, okay? So you have, where is it? I have too many things open on my desktop right now. You have this 3rd grade ELA data. This is a report that you would get with your grade level at the beginning of a year, or even in June if the state's really good about returning data quickly. This is a typical report that school districts get from their BOCES. I always say, ignore this bar graph. It's not helpful. It really just isn't, so ignore it. So if you look below, so this was from when the state assessments were measuring the Common Core standards. So all the standards you see down here are Common Core standards. But you can see here are all the standards. Here's reading literature, key ideas and details, craft and structure. Here are the standards, 3.1, 3.2. Then reading informational text. Same thing. Then there's one writing standard and then one language standard. Okay. In this column are the questions. MC is multiple choice. CR is constructed response. So if you're familiar with the state test, there are some constructed response are worth 2 points, some are worth 4 points. The longer essay is 4 points. So that's important to know because it's going to show you which questions measured which standard, okay? But beyond that, you're really only going to look at 2 columns. This first one here, percent full credit. This is the percent of students in your school that received full credit on that question. So a multiple choice, it simply means that's how many kids got it right. For a constructed response, it's tricky because they can receive partial credit. If it's a 2 point, response, they could have gotten 1 point, but it's not going to show here. Or on the 4 point, it's only going to show kids who got all 4 points. So just keep that in mind. But this column is the percentage of kids who got full credit on each question. Okay. Now these second two, it didn't scan very well, but these two columns are related. So this first column is just your district, and then these two columns is how your district compared to the BOCES. Every district will get information that shows how they did in comparison to their whole BOCES. So we're actually going to ignore the percent full credit for the BOCES. It's not really all that helpful, but we are going to look at the gap to the BOCES. What this shows is the gap between your students and all the third grade students in the BOCES. So, for example, if it's a positive number, like this here, 4%, that means your students did 4% better than third graders in the BOCES. The negative 19 means they did 19% worse than most third graders in the BOCES. Make sense? Okay, so to do stoplight highlight, we need to give it some criteria. So when we're looking at the percentage of full credit, this is the criteria that generally is going to make sense. If it's 65% or above, that's pretty green. They've got it. They're good to go. I would say 45 to 64% is yellow because it's just below. It's not that far below, but it's just below. And then 44% or below, that's certainly a pink. That's certainly alarming. Okay, but then when we look at the gap column, that's got different criteria. So any positive number is going to be green. Anything between 0 and -9, so you could include 0 in the yellow. 0 and -9 is yellow, and then pink is -10 or below. So if there is a gap of 10% or more, that is alarming. But if there's a positive number, that's super awesome, right? So what you're going to do when you stoplight highlight is take that report. You're going to go down that column of the full credit and use that criteria to highlight, and then you're going to go down the column of the gap to the BOCES and do the same thing. And then this is ultimately what your report would look like. That makes sense, right? So you can see, even if we're not looking at anything yet, like what standards we're assessing, what the numbers are, you can see how going visual makes it so much easier to analyze the data, because look at that. You can see where patterns lie. You can see how many pinks there are, how many greens there are there patterns within standards or within sections of standards, right? Going visual is so helpful. Make sense? Okay, let me go bigger here. So once you go visual, that's when you observe. And that literally means, going back to that note catcher, only writing down observations. What do you see about specific standards? Could even be specific questions within a standard, a domain, a cluster, anything that you see. So if I were going to look at this report and write down my observations, the first thing I notice, if I look at what all the pink are, they're all constructed response. So an observation would be every constructed response question is a pink. See, it's as simple as that. That's kind of a big one. Then I might look at, first let's compare overall literature to informational text. Well, if I look at the literature, I only see 4 green and 4 pink. In informational text, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 green, 4 pink. Okay, that's just an observation. I might also then look at the clusters. So key ideas and details in literature is mostly yellow and pink. Key ideas and details in informational text is mostly green. That's something to note, right? Craft and structure in literature, mostly green and yellow. Craft and structure in informational text, yellow and pink. So you see how I made those observations? I did not make any judgments. I did not think about why these things might have happened. I'm simply saying what I'm seeing. Okay? You can do the same in the gap to the BOCES column. for example, this is blurry for me. If you have the report in front of you, it would be much more clear. But this, I believe, is a constructed response for standard 5, maybe, in literature. While it was a pink for my students, it was a pink. It's also pink for the BOCES. Those pretty far below the BOCES. That might be something to write down, as is this one, which would be standard 8, I think, for informational text. Okay, that's how you make your observations. Okay, so you write those down in that note catcher. Then you're ready to make your inferences. You think about why. What are the reasons for the strengths and needs that you found? What questions do you have? What are implications for instruction? So for me, my brain is going to go immediately to those constructed response questions. And my question is, what writing instruction is happening? Because obviously it's not doing a very good job, right? So my question is, what writing instruction is happening? How often is writing instruction taking place? What materials are being used? Things like that. Now, when I think about the discrepancy between the informational and the literature, typically what we see is students do much better on literature than informational text because they've been reading more literature. Even though we want to strike an equal balance, kids read literature, stories, from the time they're teeny tiny, right? So usually key ideas and details is strong for literature, but for these third graders, that's stronger for informational text. But then the opposite is true for craft and structure. So I might infer that the amount of time spent on informational text and literature is not equal. I might ask how much time is being spent on each. I might also infer that maybe this district shifted a little too much and spent way more time on informational text than literature. I'd want to dig a little bit deeper. Hopefully all of that makes sense, but you can see how this process, this protocol, let me look at, see what the data was saying before I made any inferences or judgments. Now, it's easy to do this when they're students that you don't know, but when they are students that you know, it's so easy to jump right in with an inference or with a judgment. So this really forces you to suspend that, which is why I love it. It really is helpful. So then what you would do is think about next steps. So my next steps as the literacy coach might be to pull the third grade team together and say, let's take a look at your writing instruction. They might need some professional development. They might need some new resources. They might need to adjust their literacy blocks to allow for more time. And then I might also work with teachers to look at what texts they're using and what they're teaching, what they're using those texts to teach, and is there a good balance with literature and informational text? Make sense? So that's how you're able to develop an action plan from school level data. Now, if you're in a district where there's only one classroom per grade level, then this is also classroom level data. If you are in a larger district, you would get this report for the grade level, but then you'd also get a report that looks exactly the same for your classroom. So you go through the exact same process, but first you're looking at the whole grade level and then you're looking at your classroom. Process is the same. Does that make sense? I hope it does. Okay. Now we're going to move into student level data. So what I have for you is, again, I know that it's math and we don't always look at math, but I do have an exit ticket uploaded. It's fourth grade math. So these are the two standards that the exit ticket is measuring. So it has to do with multiplying, you can see, within word problems, but it's 4 digits by a 1-digit number. So before you even look at any of that data, make a prediction. So open up a new or make a copy of that note catcher and make some predictions. What might you see looking at fourth graders' ability to read word problems and then know to solve using multiplication of 4 digits by 1 digit and then 2 by 2 digits. So pause, open up a note catcher and make your predictions. Okay, So when you go visual in student level data, it's a little bit different, right? There isn't such clear-cut criteria like there is in a report like we just saw. So the way you're going to think about it is green, literally in students' work, you're going to highlight in green a skill that's clearly mastered. Right in their work, you go ahead and do that. Yellow would be something that's close to mastery. So something they could have made a small error. It could have been like a factual error, a process error, it doesn't matter, but small. And then red or pink is clearly students either don't have that skill, they don't understand the concept, there's a big misconception. So this process is the same, but it's going to look different because you're literally going to highlight all of your students' work. So I want you to go ahead and pause the video and go visual in that student work that I have up there for you. So once you've done that, then you can observe, right? Make some observations. What exactly do you see? So you're going to do this in a similar way. You're going to look at, you know, which questions are measuring which standards, so you can make observations about standards, but more probably what you're going to really make observations about is mathematical process, computation, conceptual understanding, lots of times organization when we're thinking about math and like lining up equations. That's a very often one, or a popular one that you would observe, but just your observations. Remember, no whys, just your observations. So if you haven't already, pause the video and jot down your observations. So once you've made your observations, now you can infer or ask your questions. What could be the reasons for those strengths and needs? What questions do you have? What implications are there for instruction? So again, process is the same, but this is going to be more targeted because you're focused on just 2 standards and you're looking so much more closely at student work. So these might differ for each student. You might ask different questions for different students. You probably are going to observe different things for different students. You might make some inferences or generalizations of groups of students based on what you're seeing, patterns across their work. So it is more cumbersome than looking at school level data. And it is a hefty process. It's not one that I would say you would do every single day with every single assessment you would do, but you're going to want to do it on those more interim assessments that you're going to use to inform your instruction. So ultimately then you would develop those next steps, what the data is telling you, what trends you see, and then what a plan would be. So again, that instructional action plan is not for you, the literacy coach, it's for the teacher. But you would want to make sure you're working with the teachers to develop a plan that is actionable, that is reasonable, and that is well aligned with what their analysis is telling them. All right, so let's revisit. Hopefully you can describe the DDI process, that cyclical process of assessing, analyzing, and then taking action. You have engaged in the DDD process a few times now to analyze assessment data. You've looked at both school level data to think about strengths and needs of a grade level, and then you've analyzed student level data to think about individual strengths and needs.